All right, so I'm going to be talking about how to read a newspaper, and particularly a newspaper from the era that we're looking at, which is October 1901 and the dinner between Booker T. Washington and President Theodore Roosevelt. What I have up here is page 4 of the Richmond Dispatch, October 18th, 1901. And the reason we found this newspaper by using the database and doing a word search for, I believe, Booker within these date ranges. And obviously, someone at the time would not have read the newspaper that way. They would have had the newspaper in front of them, probably started with the first page, and then eventually worked their way in to this page. I'm just going to talk about this page for now because I think there's a lot that you can learn just from looking at it. I think the first thing that probably will strike you when you look at it is there are an awful lot of words on the page. Certainly if you compare this to what we would see now, like a website, which would have many, many more images and other kinds of headlines, in some ways even a contemporary newspaper, this is going to seem like it's got a lot of text. The two things that stand out when you look at it, up here in the top right corner, this is an advertisement. You can tell it's an advertisement because of the way it's set off from the rest of the page, and also what's written. And of course, what's striking about this is they're advertising, I believe these are men's suits for $10 or less. We can blow it up and see a little bit more clearly what they're advertising. Let's see. You'd have to read through the whole thing in order to find out what kind of suits they are, but children's suits for less than $5 and other things. And obviously newspapers survived by advertising, so you're going to see a lot of advertising on any newspaper page. There's more advertisements down here and over here, and as with television, as with the internet, you get used to just looking past the advertisements and finding the main part of the articles. Now this page is significant because these are mostly editorials, and they're not necessarily identified that way, but this was a very common practice in newspapers at the time, to have one page set aside for editorials. And there's a couple different kinds here on this page. Again, and so the editorials are going to start here on this left column, and they basically run pretty much through this whole section. When I get it bigger, I'll be able to tell. This part up here is also very standard in newspapers. It's called, I believe, the masthead, and it actually provides the information about who publishes the newspaper, the address, the subscription prices, and those kinds of things. So again, most people who read newspapers are just going to skip over this part, but if you did want to know more about who was publishing this newspaper, this would be the place to go. It's a statement of ownership, in effect. Okay, so what we're interested in are generally these editorials. And again, what's significant about editorials and learning how to read editorials is understanding that they are meant to express the opinion of the editorial staff on the newspaper. And so they're usually written in a third-person format. We believe, our opinion is, you basically trying to get the reader to agree with a certain position. We don't know, in this case, whether the editor is writing them himself, presumably it's a man, or whether there's an editorial board, but there's some sense in which this section of the paper is speaking for the editorial collective. It's different from news articles, which should be written in a more objective, impersonal style. Obviously, it's different from advertisements. It's different from feature stories that might be more about society, they might be more about food, they might be about a restaurant, they might be about an activity, whatever. The editorials are usually trying to address kind of more substantive kinds of issues. And so the fact that in this issue, the newspaper editorial wrote about the Booker T. Washington dinner tells you that it's significant, and it tells you that the editors are trying to take a particular position on this question. Now, often editorials will address a range of issues. They might be about domestic issues, as in the case of the Booker T. Washington dinner. They might be about local issues, in this case Richmond City or some of the surrounding counties. Sometimes they're about international issues, although in this era that would have been less likely, but a question of a treaty, a question of certainly going to war, those will get editorial attention as well. And so these are the kinds of questions that will come up in these editorials. Certainly when you've got an election underway, which was true in Virginia in the fall of 1901, you're going to see a lot of attention to this issue in the course of by looking at these editorials. Now the one we're interested in, see if I can get this to go up. Nope, we didn't want to do that at all. Actually starts down here at the bottom. It's a little, for that reason, it's a little hard to find, but again, you see the headline here, Roosevelt dines a darky. And often editorial headlines will be intended to grab your attention, okay, even more so than, I mean, any newspaper headline is designed to do that, but often the editorial headline is trying to do that even more explicitly, although here you see a different example. You know, Secretary Gage's speech is a much more kind of straightforward, this is what we're responding to. But this one I think is striking again, as we can talk about when we look at the specific article itself, but again, calling attention to Roosevelt and the activity he did with Booker T. Washington, but referring to Washington as a darky. And so you can see in the course of this, when the editorial talks about we believe or we think, that's what they're trying to do, to talk in terms of the kind of collective opinion of these editors. If you look at the rest of these pages, some of what's here, there are some other editorials here. Some of them are quite short. They're almost passing comments. In this case, an election in New York City. Here about the United States Bank. Up here about the discovery of the Arctic and the Perry expedition. You know, so kind of a real range of topics and issues that are going to be covered in these editorials. Over here you get a little bit more news articles. So the editorial section is really these three columns. And again, it was very common practice at this time for readers to really pay attention to the editorials. This was, you know, where you found the kind of opinion, the expression of opinion at this time. And newspapers were known for their editorial position, particularly in the case of elections. Some would be more sympathetic to Republicans, some more to Democrats. Obviously, on the question of race, most Southern newspapers were very rigid, are very strong supporters of a rigid enforcement of Jim Crow separation. In the case of African American newspapers, obviously the editorial position would be quite different. But there's a sense in which, you know, a reader looking at the editorials expects a certain kind of opinion. They expect to be an attempt to persuade them of a belief. It's not like a news article where you're looking for facts, you're looking for description, you're looking for quotations. The editorial is much more, it's a form of persuasive writing, and they do follow a certain kind of format. And again, you can see that when you look more closely at this editorial.